Now, a warning to keep over-the-counter medications out of your child's reach. This is all about allergy and sleep medications. A health advisory by the nonprofit America's Poison Centers says calls to poison centers involving diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, and some over-the-counter sleep meds has more than doubled so far this year, and those calls involve teenagers. This is another one of those challenges we've seen online where some users, in this case, have documented taking excessive amounts of the drug, trying to overcome the drowsy effects of the medication, experiencing that euphoric feeling or a high. Dr. Beth Woods, a Purveyor Health pediatric cardiologist, says a Benadryl challenge is dangerous. She says high doses can cause confusion, hallucinations, dangerous heart rhythm, seizures, coma, even death. Some of the warning signs to look for are unusual sleepiness or inability to wake up, vomiting, trouble walking. And if you think your teen or child may have taken too much Benadryl or any medication, doctors say don't wait, call poison control right away. And that number is 1-800-222-1222. Dr. Woods says parents should store all meds securely out of reach of kids and teens. So important to also talk with your child about these social media challenges. Remind them that just because something is online or available over the counter does not mean it's safe. Also be aware diphenhydramine is found in a lot of products, not just Benadryl. We've not been made aware of anyone impacted here, but the advisory does come days after 3 kids in Connecticut died from apparent diphenhydramine overdoses over the last 2 months. They could not confirm whether those deaths were connected to this social media challenge.